she didn't know what she brought back with her. Not at first. The woman who returned from those ruins in 1978 wasn't the same woman who left 3 weeks earlier with a camera and a notebook, chasing stories about a forgotten asylum in rural Pennsylvania. Her family noticed it immediately. The way she would stop mid-sentence and stare at the corner of the room. The way she refused to sleep with the lights off. The way she kept saying the same thing over and over, in a voice that didn't sound like hers anymore. They're still there. They never left. Her name was Margaret Holloway, 42 years old. A freelance journalist who specialized in architectural history, the kind of work that took her into places most people had long abandoned. She had 3 children, a husband who taught literature at a community college, and a modest home in a Philadelphia suburb where nothing unusual had ever happened, until she came back from Pennhurst. That's what the locals called it, the Eastern State School and Hospital, a place where Pennsylvania sent the children and adults it didn't want to see anymore. The ones they called defective, feeble-minded, unfit for society. Margaret had gone there to document what remained. The state had finally closed it that year, after decades of investigations, scandals, and testimony that made grown men weep in courtrooms. She wanted to capture the architecture before it disappeared completely, before the state demolished the evidence of what had happened inside those walls. She spent 3 weeks walking those corridors with her camera. 3 weeks alone in rooms where the paint peeled like skin, where restraint chairs still sat bolted to floors stained with things she didn't want to identify, where the isolation cells were so small you couldn't extend your arms. She photographed everything: the hydrotherapy tubs, the operating theater, the day room where residents had been left in their own waste for days at a time. But she also found something else, something that wasn't in any official record. In the oldest wing, the section they'd stopped using in the 1950s, she found a door that shouldn't have opened. Behind it, a staircase descending into darkness that her flashlight barely penetrated. And at the bottom, a room that made her camera malfunction. A room where the temperature dropped so severely she could see her breath crystallize in the air. A room where names had been carved into every surface, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, scratched by fingernails and makeshift tools. Names of people who were never supposed to be remembered. She took one photograph in that room, just one. And when she got home and developed it, she saw them, standing in the background, watching her. Margaret's husband, Thomas, kept a journal during those first months after she returned. He didn't mean for anyone to read it. It was just his way of trying to understand what was happening to his wife, to document the changes so that maybe, eventually, he could find a pattern. Some explanation that made sense. The journal was discovered in 2003, 25 years later, in a storage unit in New Jersey that nobody in the family remembered renting. Inside were 47 pages of observations that read less like a concerned spouse's notes and more like a field researcher documenting the behavior of something that had replaced the person he married. The first entry is dated October 12, 1978, 4 days after Margaret came home. Thomas wrote that she wouldn't let anyone touch the camera bag. She kept it with her constantly, even brought it to the bathroom, slept with it beside the bed. When their youngest daughter asked to see the photographs from the trip, Margaret locked herself in the darkroom for 6 hours. When she finally emerged, her hands were burned. Chemical burns from the developing fluid. She'd been standing in it, Thomas wrote, just standing in the tray of chemicals with her bare hands submerged, staring at something he couldn't see. November 3rd, Margaret started sleepwalking, not unusual by itself, but Thomas noted the specificity of it. She would walk to their daughter's room, stand at the foot of the bed, and whisper a list of names. Different names every night. He started writing them down. Sarah Kemp, Daniel Morrison, Elizabeth Chen, Robert Valdez, dozens of them. When he looked them up at the public library using birth and death records for Pennsylvania, he found something that made him stop sleeping through the night. Every single name Margaret whispered was a person who had died at Pennhurst. Children, mostly, the ones who didn't make it past their first year in the institution. By December, the children were afraid of their mother, not because she was violent or cruel, but because of what their oldest son described as the way she looked through them instead of at them. Like they were transparent. Like she was seeing something standing where they stood. The family doctor suggested psychiatric evaluation. Margaret agreed to go. She sat in the psychiatrist's office for 50 minutes without speaking, and when the session was over, the doctor told Thomas he wouldn't be taking Margaret on as a patient. He refused to explain why. Thomas wrote in his journal that the doctor's hands were shaking when he said it. Christmas came and went without celebration. Margaret had stopped eating anything except plain bread and water. She'd lost 26 pounds. Her hair was falling out in clumps, and she'd begun construction of something in the basement. Thomas didn't know what to call it. A sculpture maybe, or a model. built from cardboard and newspaper and what looked like dried flowers but smelled like decay. It was a replica of something, a building. When Thomas asked her what building it was, Margaret looked at him with eyes that had gone completely flat and said, "The place where they kept the ones who screamed too much. The place where they learned how to be quiet forever." The photograph still exists. It's been examined by 3 different universities, analyzed by forensic specialists, and dismissed by skeptics as a double exposure or darkroom error. But the people who've seen the original negative, the actual film that was inside Margaret's camera that day in the basement of Penhurst, they don't dismiss it. They just stop talking about it. Because what the photograph shows isn't easily explained away. The image itself is unremarkable at first glance. A stone room maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with walls covered in those carved names. The floor is concrete. There's a drain in the center. In the corner, you can see part of what looks like a metal bed frame, rusted through, bolted to the floor. Margaret's flashlight created a harsh circle of light in the center of the frame, leaving the edges in deep shadow. Standard documentary photography, the kind of image you'd see in any historical archive about institutional abuse. But in the shadows just beyond where the flashlight reached, there are figures, 17 of them, according to the detailed analysis done by a photographic forensics lab in Boston. 17 distinct shapes that shouldn't be there. They're not clearly defined. They're more like impressions, areas where the darkness seems denser, more purposeful. But when you look closely, when you really examine the grain of the film, you can see details that make your skin crawl. The suggestion of small hands, the outline of faces too thin to be living, the posture of bodies that have learned to make themselves smaller, trying to disappear into corners because visibility meant punishment. One figure stands closer to the camera than the others, close enough that you can see it with clarity that feels wrong, like the film captured something that existed in a different kind of space. A child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing what looks like a hospital gown that hangs on a frame so emaciated that every rib is visible. The face is the worst part. Not because it's monstrous or inhuman, but because it's neither. It's the face of a child who died slowly, who knew they were dying, who understood that nobody was coming to help. And the eyes, though they're just dark spaces in the photograph, seem to look directly at whoever is viewing the image, tracking them. Margaret told her husband that when she took that photograph, her camera's light meter went haywire. The needle swung violently back and forth, and the temperature reading on her watch dropped from 68 degrees to 40, one in under 30 seconds. She said she could hear breathing in that room. Not her own, multiple sources of it, surrounding her, the sound of damaged lungs struggling to pull air through throats that had been screaming until the tissue tore. She took the picture and ran. Didn't stop running until she was out of the building in her car, driving away from that place with her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She developed the film 3 days later. And when she saw what was in that photograph, she called the one person she thought might understand, a researcher at Penn State who had published a paper about residual energy in locations of mass trauma. The researcher's name was Dr. Elizabeth Cormier. She agreed to meet with Margaret. That meeting lasted 4 hours. And at the end of it, Dr. Cormier told Margaret something that would define everything that came after. You didn't just photograph them. You made contact. And now they know how to find you. What happened at Penhurst wasn't hidden. Not really. There were investigations, congressional hearings, a television expose in 1968 that showed the American public what their tax dollars were funding, overcrowded wards where human beings were kept in conditions that would have been criminal for livestock, children left naked in cribs, lying in their own waste for days, residents with treatable conditions left to deteriorate because there was no treatment, only containment. The use of physical restraints is standard practice. The isolation cells where people were locked alone in the dark for weeks at a time, sometimes for minor infractions like speaking too loudly or making eye contact with staff. But what wasn't in those reports, what never made it into the official record, were the things that happened in the oldest sections of the institution. The wings that predated the reforms, such as they were. The places where the experimental treatments occurred, where doctors practiced procedures that had been discredited everywhere else. Where children who couldn't speak for themselves became subjects in studies about pain tolerance, about the malleability of the human mind under sustained sensory deprivation, about how much neglect a body could endure before it simply gave up. The room Margaret photographed was in one of those sections. Built in 1908, sealed off in 1957 after an incident that was never fully documented. According to the maintenance records that still exist, that entire wing was closed because of structural damage, water infiltration, foundation issues. But the workers who were employed at Penhurst in the 50s told different stories to their families. Stories about sounds coming from that sealed wing, about doors that wouldn't stay locked, about the night shift attendants who refused to go near that section after dark because they could hear children crying in a building that had been empty for months. One worker, a man named Robert Chen who worked at Penhurst from 1954 until it closed, gave an interview in 1995, 2 years before he died. He was 83 years old. His memory was sharp, and what he described was a culture of systematic erasure. Children who died at the institution were often buried on the grounds in unmarked graves. Sometimes their families were notified. Often they weren't. Sometimes the families had placed their children at Penhurst believing it was temporary, that once the child improved they could come home. They would call for updates and be told their child was doing fine. They would plan visits and be told the child wasn't ready for visitors yet. This would go on for months, sometimes years. And then one day they would receive a brief letter stating that their child had passed away from pneumonia or complications from a fall or some other convenient explanation, and the body had already been interred, and there was nothing more to be done. Robert Chen said he watched this happen dozens of times. He said the administration kept 2 sets of records. The official files that showed deaths as unfortunate but natural occurrences in a population with complex medical needs, and the real records, kept in a locked file cabinet in the director's office that documented the truth. The residents who died from infected bed sores that went untreated, the ones who starved because they couldn't feed themselves and there weren't enough staff to help them, the ones who suffered fatal injuries during restraint procedures that were supposed to be therapeutic, the children who simply stopped breathing during experimental treatments that were never approved by any medical board. Those real records disappeared in 1978, the same year the institution closed. The same year Margaret Holloway spent 3 weeks documenting what remained. Robert Chen said he always wondered who took them, who decided that evidence needed to vanish. But he knew why, because if the public ever learned the true count of who died in that place and how they died, there would be prosecutions. There would be accountability. And the people who ran Penhurst, the doctors and administrators and state officials who knew exactly what was happening inside those walls, they had families and careers and reputations to protect. By January of 1979, Margaret had stopped leaving the house entirely. Thomas had taken a leave of absence from his teaching position to care for the children because Margaret could no longer be trusted alone with them. Not because she was dangerous, but because she had become absent in a way that was worse than physical abandonment. She would sit at the kitchen table for hours, staring at nothing, her lips moving in silent conversation with people who weren't there. The children learned to move quietly through the house, learned not to ask their mother for anything, learned to pretend she wasn't slowly disappearing in front of them. The model in the basement had grown. It now took up half the floor space, a sprawling recreation of the entire Penhurst complex built from materials that Margaret scavenged from around the house and, apparently, from places Thomas couldn't identify. There were pieces in that model made from things that looked organic, things that might have been bone or preserved tissue. When Thomas asked where she got them, Margaret said they were gifts, from the children who wanted to be remembered, from the ones who never got proper burials, from the residents who were still there in that place, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge what happened to them. Dr. Cormier visited 3 times during this period. She brought equipment with her, recording devices, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors. She documented anomalies that she said were consistent with what she called persistent traumatic imprinting. Temperature drops of 30 to 40 degrees in specific areas of the house, always near wherever Margaret was sitting, electronic equipment malfunctioning, recordings that picked up sounds that shouldn't have been there, whispers and crying, and once, something that sounded like a child asking for their mother in a voice so filled with pain that Dr. Cormier stopped the playback and never listened to it again. But the most disturbing evidence came from the photographs Dr. Cormier took of Margaret. In every image, standing just behind her, or beside her, or sometimes overlapping with her physical form, there were the same figures from that room at Penhurst, getting clearer, becoming more defined, as if they were using Margaret as a doorway between where they were and where we are. Dr. Cormier showed these photographs to colleagues at 3 different universities. 2 of them refused to comment. The third, a professor of psychology who specialized in trauma and memory, looked at the images for less than a minute before handing them back and saying that whatever was happening to Margaret Holloway, it wasn't psychological. It was something else, something that existed in the overlap between what we remember and what refuses to be forgotten. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If this was happening to someone you loved, and every expert you consulted either refused to help or confirmed that the impossible was real. Thomas made his decision in February. He packed up the children and left. He didn't tell Margaret. He just waited until she was locked in the basement with her model, loaded everything they owned into a rental truck, and drove to his brother's house in Ohio. He left a note on the kitchen table that said he was sorry, that he loved her, that he hoped she would find her way back. But he couldn't watch her disappear anymore. He couldn't let the children grow up in a house where the boundaries between the living and the dead had become so thin they could hear voices in the walls at night. Margaret didn't notice they were gone for 3 days. When she finally emerged from the basement, she walked through the empty house without any visible reaction. Then she went to the telephone and made a single call. To Penhurst. The building was abandoned by then, locked and scheduled for demolition. But Margaret called the old number anyway, and according to the phone company records that were subpoenaed later, someone answered. The call lasted 47 minutes. And when it ended, Margaret got in her car and drove back to Pennsylvania, back to the ruins, back to the place where the shadows were waiting for her to come home. The police found Margaret's car in the Penhurst parking lot on February 18, 1979. The driver's side door was open. Her purse was on the seat. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside the car, they found her camera bag. Inside the bag, they found 43 rolls of undeveloped film. When those rolls were processed, they showed the same thing over and over again. The interior of that sealed wing, the room with the carved names, and the figures becoming more solid in each successive image, as if they were learning how to be seen. The search for Margaret lasted 6 weeks. They brought in dogs. They searched every building on the grounds, every tunnel, every area that was accessible. They found nothing, no body. No evidence of foul play, no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. The case was eventually classified as a missing person investigation. Thomas was questioned extensively. So were the children. So was Dr. Cormier. None of them had answers that satisfied the investigators. The prevailing theory became that Margaret had suffered a mental breakdown and either died somewhere on the property that hadn't been searched or had left the area entirely and started a new life somewhere else. The case went cold. But there were details that never made it into the official reports. Details that the responding officers discussed among themselves, but never put in writing because they knew how it would sound. Like the fact that when they searched the building, they found fresh footprints in the dust. Dozens of them, all small child-sized, leading from the sealed wing down into the basement levels that hadn't been opened in decades. Or the fact that multiple officers reported hearing children's voices echoing through the empty corridors. Or that the search dogs refused to enter certain areas of the building, would plant their feet and pull back on their leashes with a kind of terror that their handlers had never seen before. One officer, a 20-year veteran named Marcus Webb, wrote about his experience in a personal journal that his daughter found after he died in 2019. He described entering that sealed wing, following the trail of footprints down to the basement level. He described finding a room that matched the one in Margaret's photographs. He described seeing the names carved into the walls, thousands of them, and recognizing some of them from the old Penhurst death records he'd reviewed during the investigation. And he described finding something else. In the center of that room, arranged in a careful circle, were items that hadn't been there when the building was closed. Children's clothing, toys, photographs, and in the middle of the circle, a woman's jacket that Thomas Holloway identified as belonging to his wife. Marcus Webb wrote that he stood in that room for less than a minute before he had to leave. Not because of any specific threat, but because of what he felt standing there. The overwhelming sense of being watched by dozens of eyes. The pressure of accumulated suffering so intense it was almost physical. The knowledge certain and absolute that something was waiting in that room, not for him, but waiting nonetheless, patient, eternal, for someone else to wander down into that darkness and make the same mistake Margaret had made, to bear witness, to try to document the undocumentable, to shine a light into a corner of American history that was never supposed to be illuminated. The investigation was closed in 1981. Margaret Holloway was declared legally dead in 1986. Thomas remarried in 1989. The children grew up, had families of their own, and tried to move past what happened to their mother. Cormier published one more paper about her work in 1982, and then left academia entirely. She refused all interviews, refused all follow-up questions. When a journalist tracked her down in 2001 and asked why she'd abandoned her research, she said only that some doors, once opened, can't be closed, and some truths, once witnessed, extract a price that no reasonable person would choose to pay. Penhurst still stands. Parts of it, anyway. The demolition that was planned never happened. Budget issues, environmental concerns, legal complications with the property. The official explanations shift depending on who you ask, but the buildings remain slowly collapsing under the weight of their own history. The grounds are fenced off. There are no trespassing signs posted every 50 feet. Security patrols the perimeter, and yet people still get inside. Urban explorers, ghost hunters, people with cameras looking for something to document. Some of them come back with photographs that show the same figures Margaret captured in 1978, standing in doorways, visible in the corners of rooms, watching from windows in buildings that should be too structurally unsound to enter. Some of them come back changed in ways their families struggle to articulate. Quieter, more distant, as if they left something behind in those ruins or brought something back with them that doesn't sleep and doesn't forget. And some of them don't come back at all. There have been 17 disappearances associated with the Penhurst property since 1979. 17 people who entered those buildings and were never seen again. Local police now treat the site as a high-priority concern. They've increased patrols. They've installed cameras. They've even explored the option of finally demolishing what remains just to eliminate the risk. But here's what keeps that from happening. When crews have been sent in to assess the buildings for demolition, they report the same thing Margaret did. Malfunctioning equipment. Unexplained temperature drops. The sense of being watched by something that doesn't want them there. 3 separate contractors have refused to bid on the demolition project. 2 workers who entered the sealed wing for structural assessment quit their jobs the same day and left the construction industry entirely. One of them, a man named David Porter, who had 23 years of experience in demolition and had worked on projects involving buildings with documented asbestos and biohazards, said he would rather lose his livelihood than spend another minute inside that place. Margaret's children are in their 50s now. They've tried to distance themselves from what happened to their mother. They don't use the Holloway name anymore. They don't discuss it with their own children. But in 2018, Margaret's youngest daughter, Sarah, received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a photograph. Not one of Margaret's original images from Penhurst, but something new. A recent photograph, based on the digital metadata, taken inside that same room with the carved names. And standing in the center of the frame, facing the camera with an expression that could be recognition or accusation or simply acknowledgement, was a woman who looked exactly like Margaret Holloway would look if she had aged 40 years in darkness. Sarah took the photograph to police. They investigated but found nothing. No evidence of tampering. No indication of who sent it or why. The metadata showed it was taken on February 18, 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after Margaret disappeared. Sarah has kept the photograph. She doesn't look at it. She keeps it in a safe deposit box at a bank 3 states away from where she lives. But she knows it's there, and she knows that eventually someone else will receive a package. Someone else will have to decide what to do with evidence that the past isn't past, that the people who died in that place, who were forgotten and erased and buried in unmarked graves, they're still there, still waiting, still trying to make someone understand that what happened to them was real, that they mattered, that they deserve to be remembered. This is what remains of Margaret Holloway. Not answers, not closure, just the knowledge that some places hold onto their trauma so tightly that it becomes something else. Something that exists independent of time or death or justice. Something that reaches out to anyone who gets close enough and says, "Bear witness, remember us, carry us with you." And once you've heard that voice, once you've felt the weight of those accumulated deaths pressing against the walls of a room that shouldn't still exist, you can't unhear it. You can't forget. You can only choose whether to look away and pretend you don't know, or to acknowledge that beneath the surface of American history, buried in the foundations of institutions we built to hide people we didn't want to see, there are truths we never fully reckoned with. And they're not done with us yet.